Now we can speak about the reason that we see fatigue. So the resistance to fatigue that's experienced with different types of intensity exercises. So basically the reason that we see fatigue in different types of fibers and different types of activities. So when we're undergoing high intensity activities, again, think about a bodybuilder, lifting really heavy, we're using mostly glycolytic fibers for that type of activity. And so the reason that we see fatigue is because of the lactic acid buildup. We also see fatigue because of the strong contractions that are seen with these muscles. So these muscles are bigger, right, larger in their diameter. They're also going to produce more forceful contractions as well. And so these stronger contractions actually compress the blood vessels that are surrounding some of these muscles. So although there aren't many capillaries, they still rely on blood coming in from the blood vessels that are surrounding. And so these stronger, more forceful contractions actually sometimes contract or compress the blood vessels and impede the ability for these muscles to receive enough blood supply. Another reason that we see fatigue is just neuromuscular fatigue. So again, because these muscles are larger, they generate more force, they actually deplete the amount of neurotransmitter at the junction, the amount of vesicles at the junction. And so that type of neuromuscular fatigue can also contribute to the overall fatigue of the muscle. There's also altered enzyme activity. So again, because we build up that lactic acid, remember, this is an acid, it's going to produce this acidic environment. And our enzymes, such as our glycolytic enzymes, even our creatine kinase, which is an enzyme, those enzymes are going to be denatured at these acidic, pH, these acidic environments. And so that altered enzymatic activity can also contribute to the fatigue that we see with higher intensity activities. Now, this type of fatigue will recover usually, more quickly within minutes to hours. And again, think about a bodybuilder, if after he's done lifting a heavy set, within minutes to hours, that lactic burn will eventually start to wear off. And so higher intensity exercises recover, quicker, usually within minutes to hours of that exercise. Now, when we look at low intensity exercise, the resistance that we see to that, or the fatigue rather, is due to the depletion of energy reserves, so glycogen. And because we're relying on that for this type of activity, that to be sustained, when we deplete those energy reserves, we then have this fatigue within the muscle because it's usually sustaining this type of contraction for a longer period of time. And although we have oxygen coming in, we still deplete the amount of ATP that we have lingering, and that can sometimes contribute to the fatigue that we see with this type of muscle. This is going to take a longer time to recover or to get back to those normal glycogen levels, if that makes sense. It's going to take a day to maybe a couple days for those glycogen reserves to build back up. And so it's going to take a longer time to recover from some of the fatigue that we see with lower intensity exercises. And it just kind of makes sense, right? If it takes longer for this fatigue to occur, it likewise will take a longer time to recover from this type of fatigue. We also want to bring in the idea of psychological fatigue. And this really comes into play when we speak about athletes. So psychological fatigue is basically, you can have muscles that are, physically still contracting or are able to contract, able to sustain contractions, but psychologically, if you are fatigued in your mind mentally, then those muscles likewise will become fatigued as well. And so there's this underlying psychological component to muscle fatigue that we sometimes are able to experience or even use as an advantage, again, in the case of athletes. So we can tap into this will to win, which is what that's being described as, where athletes can use that psychological component, and in the opposite, they can tap into this and they can kind of just power through really strenuous, really vigorous physical activity for longer periods of time. And I really think about long distance runners, and if you've ran a marathon, I'm sure you know what that feels like. They can tap into that psychological component and just kind of power through, even in instances when glycogen reserves have been, depleted, when, they've been going for long periods of time, when the muscles are physically fatigued and the mind keeps going, then we can just kind of power through some of those longer low intensity exercises. So there is a psychological component to muscle fatigue as well. Okay, so here we're looking at just kind of describing what fatigue is. And so we see that if we stimulate a muscle, it will contract at the same, tension production that we see continuously and sustained. So if I stimulate this muscle, the next time it contracts, it'll give me the same maximum tension, on and on and on and on. But if a muscle is fatigued and I stimulate that muscle, there becomes a time where if I stimulate it, it no longer gives me that same maximum tension production. And so after a while, the amount of tension or force that's being produced will progressively decline until stimulating that muscle gives me absolutely no tension or no contraction because the muscle is just too fatigued to do so. We also see fatigued after tetanus, and we described what tetanus is, right? There's sustained kind of exhaustion of the muscle where there's no relaxation in between. And so this is just increasing the frequency of stimulating the muscle. And then after that period, the muscle is fatigued, but not only just beyond this period, even if I were to rest this muscle for a period of time, the next time I would stimulate that muscle, it would be fatigued more quickly. So we can talk about fatigue of a muscle just in terms of the decline in force production, but we can also talk about fatigue in terms of its responsiveness even after periods of rest. So a fatigued muscle may fatigue after, tetanus, but then if I allow that muscle to rest and I try to stimulate it again, it will fatigue more quickly than it did the first time around until it has been able to, adequately recover from that fatigue. All right, so let's talk about some of the responses of muscle to exercise. And this is where we get into conditioning muscle. Now, I want to mention here, we can change the source of ATP production of a muscle. So that is, if I'm a long distance runner and my muscles are primarily relying on oxidative phosphorylation, I can start, sprinting and lifting heavy weights, and I can start training my muscles to become oxidative in their ATP production. So I can change the ATP source of a muscle, but I cannot change the speed of a muscle. So I can never make a fast fiber become slow, and I can never make a slow fiber become fast, but I can condition a glycolytic fiber to become more oxidative, and I can condition an oxidative fiber to rely more on anaerobic glycolysis. And so on that basis, if I'm doing lots of aerobic exercises, aerobic activity, I'm going to increase my oxidative capacity. I'm going to convert some of my fast glycolytic fibers into fast oxidative fibers. Again, they cannot become slow, so they can become fast. They can go from fast glycolytic to fast oxidative. I can increase the size and number of my mitochondria, increase the decrease the fiber diameter, right? Remember, these oxidative fibers rely more on that diffusion of oxygen, and so they're going to need to be smaller in their size. And then I'm going to increase the number of capillaries that are surrounding those muscle fibers. And this is why, as a part of heart health, it's encouraged to do aerobic activities because they actually increase, blood supply, they increase circulation, they increase, the diameter of the number rather of capillaries that are coming to muscle. And that is just an overall healthy environment, not just for our other muscles, but for the heart as well. And so as a part of heart health and overall health, in most instances, aerobic exercises are encouraged. When we think about high intensity, heavy intensity exercises, again, things like sprinting, heavy lifting, and I keep bringing up those practical examples so you have an idea of, distinguishing between different types of activities. This type of exercise is going to condition muscles to rely more on anaerobic glycolysis. So they're going to decrease their oxidative capacity. We can sometimes convert fast oxidative fibers into fast glycolytic fibers. So again, the oxidative can be converted into glycolytic, but not the fast into slow, or vice versa. We'll decrease the size and number of mitochondria, and we're going to increase the fiber diameter and reduce the resistance to fatigue, okay? Not reduce the resistance, but we'll see reduced resistance to fatigue. So these muscles are going to fatigue much more quickly than aerobic exercises. And so again, as a part of general health, we prefer aerobic exercises because when we do lots of high intensity exercises, the muscles become bigger. They become more of a burden to our circulatory system, right? It's just bigger, harder to, actually supply those muscles and maintain that blood supply. And on top of that, we actually decrease mitochondria, we decrease capillaries, which again is not the best environment that we want muscles or our general body to be in. And so aerobic exercise are going to be better off for overall health and heart health, especially because the heart is a giant muscle. And then the last thing we'll speak about here as it pertains to fiber types is disuse atrophy. So as we decrease our use in muscle, we actually decrease the size of those muscles as well. And so we lose the myofibrils. So remember I talked about the idea that we can't change the actin and myosin filaments on a sarcomere. We also cannot change the number of muscle fibers in a muscle. What we can manipulate by either using that muscle or not using that muscle is the number of myofibrils that are jammed within those muscle fibers. And so when I bulk up a muscle by working out and it gets really big, I'm actually putting more myofibrils to increase the diameter. But if I don't use a muscle, either because I'm no longer working out or actual neuromuscular dystrophies such as myasthenia gravis or other muscular dystrophies where we're not innervating that muscle appropriately, so it's not being used, then I will see a decrease in the number of myofibrils that are within that muscle fiber. This leads us to talk about muscular dystrophy as a whole. So muscular dystrophies are seen anytime there is a disorder that prevents that muscle from being innervated or energized. It prevents that end plate potential from happening the way it should. And so there are different reasons that explain muscular dystrophies. There are congenital disorders like Duchenne's and Beckles, but then there are also neuromuscular junction disorders that we talked about, so some of the toxins that have an influence on the amount of neurotransmitter, et cetera. But there are different reasons for muscular dystrophies, but essentially that muscle is no longer contracting the way it should. And so because of that disuse, whether intentionally or not, we see a decrease in the size as we lose those myofibrils that are within that muscle fiber. Okay, all right. So I'm gonna pause here. I don't think we're going to get into the next objective, which is really getting into smoothing cardiac muscle. And it might be better to kind of segue from smoothing cardiac muscle into the cardiovascular system. So we'll kind of pick up with that after the break. And I'll probably let us use the remaining minutes to think about these checkpoint questions here. So the first question, how does creatine phosphate help to maintain an adequate supply of ATP at the start of muscle contraction? All right. So in the interest of time, I'll kind of just go over the answers here, but make sure that you write the answers down and understand why the answers are so. So basically we said that creatine phosphate was a way for us to have ATP sitting on tap, just ready for the start of muscle contraction, because muscles are so responsive, right? When I think to move my muscle, there shouldn't be a delay between the time it takes to energize, that process and to actually see muscle contraction. And so in order for that energy to be ready to go, the creatine phosphate system allows for us to have that ATP just sitting, waiting on tap to start the muscle contraction, while the other more sustainable processes such as oxidative phosphorylation and anaerobic glycolysis kind of get warmed up. The second question here, what is the major difference between slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers? So we said that there are two main differences between these two fibers. One is their rate of myosin ATPase activity. So the rate at which we can hydrolyze that hydrolyze that ATP that's bound to the myosin head. If we can hydrolyze it very quickly, we can drive that cross-bridge cycling quicker. And then the second difference is the rate of the calcium ATPase activity as well. So again, if muscle can clear that calcium from the sarcoplasm more quickly, it can relax more quickly, and it can likewise contract more quickly as well. Which three types of fibers are found in skeletal muscle? So we talked about three fiber types that are seen throughout the body. So on one end of the spectrum, slow oxidative fibers, slower in their contraction, more ATP production. These are reliant on oxidative phosphorylation. And then on the other end of the spectrum are fast glycolytic fibers, so faster in their contraction, reliant on anaerobic glycolysis, which is a faster mechanism of making ATP, but it produces less ATP and it's got that lactic acid buildup associated. And then in the middle, we've got the fast oxidative fibers, which are kind of an intermediate between both, but they are still oxidative in terms of their primary mode of ATP production. And then lastly here, how does aerobic exercise affect resistance to fatigue in muscle? How is resistance to fatigue affected by high intensity exercises, and then why? So we said that aerobic exercises are going to basically make muscle less resistant to fatigue as we rely more on aerobic mechanisms of ATP production. So that is oxidative phosphorylation. We train our muscles to have a smaller diameter, rely more on oxygen, have more mitochondria. They don't have that lactic acid buildup, and then they have more efficient quantities of ATP production. Whereas if we're training our muscles to rely more on high intensity exercises, we're going to start to see lactic acid buildup, which is going to contribute to an increase in the resistance to fatigue. They're going to have larger diameters, less capillaries, and they're going to produce less ATP with that lactic acid as that price to pay.